Hello everyone, and here are the details of today's video. For many observers, the United States' criticism of Europe's defense posture appears abrupt or overly harsh. Yet, for those who have followed transatlantic relations across decades, Washington's frustration is not new. It is the culmination of a structural imbalance that traces back to the very architecture of the post-1945 security order. The U.S. is not reacting to a sudden crisis. It is reacting to the realization that the model it built to stabilize Europe now prevents Europe from stabilizing itself. The heart of the American critique is simple. Europe remains wealthy, sophisticated, and politically influential, yet incapable of providing for its own security. This paradox has troubled every U.S. administration since Eisenhower. In the years after World War II, America's overwhelming military presence was essential to protect a devastated Europe from Soviet expansion. But as Europe recovered, prospered, and integrated economically, the U.S. expected its allies to assume a greater share of the burden. That expectation was never fully met. Europe built social welfare states, invested in education, healthcare, and green policies, while relying on the U.S. for nuclear deterrence, high-end military technology, global force projection, and much of the intelligence infrastructure needed for modern defense. Washington did not object to Europe's social choices. It objected to the widening gap between Europe's political ambitions and its military capabilities. The war in Ukraine brought this tension into sharp relief. While European leaders expressed moral outrage at Russia's invasion, it was the United States that supplied the bulk of the advanced weaponry, surveillance data, and logistical support. European stockpiles of ammunition ran low. Production lines proved insufficient. Procurement processes were slow. Europe spoke the language of strategic autonomy, yet acted with the dependence of a region still anchored to an older security framework. From Washington's perspective, this contradiction is unsustainable. The U.S. faces growing pressures in the Indo-Pacific, where China's rise demands far greater attention and resources. Washington does not want to abandon Europe, but it no longer believes that Europe should remain a strategic ward of the United States. American policymakers increasingly argue that Europe cannot call for a tougher stance against Russia while expecting the U.S. to bear the costs and risks of that stance. Thus, the criticism is less an indictment of Europe's morality than an indictment of its preparedness. The U.S. sees a continent that talks like a geopolitical actor, but spends like a post-historical welfare society. In Washington's view, Europe cannot have it both ways. If it wants to shape global affairs, it must assume the burdens of power, not outsource them. Ultimately, Washington's critique is not a demand for obedience, but a demand for maturity. It reflects the belief that the transatlantic relationship must evolve from protector-dependent to genuine partners. Yet this evolution requires Europe to confront a difficult truth. Its security identity remains incomplete, and until it resolves this unfinished project, American frustration will only deepen. To understand the depth of American irritation toward Europe, one must return to the architecture of the post-war world, a world the United States designed and financed, and which Europe inhabited with a paradoxical blend of gratitude and complacency. What Washington now criticizes is not a temporary imbalance, but a structural dependency that Europe never truly attempted to overcome. After 1945, Europe was shattered, its industries destroyed, its finances exhausted, its confidence shaken. The U.S. stepped in not only with the Marshall Plan, but with a security umbrella that protected Western Europe from Soviet power. NATO, though ostensibly an alliance of equals, quickly became a framework in which the U.S. supplied the overwhelming share of nuclear deterrence, strategic capabilities, and global force projection. Europe rebuilt its prosperity under the shelter of American arms. This arrangement made sense in 1950. It was increasingly illogical by 1990. And today, in 2025, it borders on untenable. By the 1970 seconds, Europe had become economically vibrant, wealthy, integrated, and technologically advanced, yet its defense budgets remained strikingly low. Welfare spending ballooned while military spending flatlined. The assumption, rarely spoken aloud but universally accepted, was that the United States would always be there to deter the Soviet Union, to police crises in the Balkans, to confront terrorism, and now to contain Russia. America's frustration grew because Europe's dependency became self-reinforcing. A nation or continent that outsources its security inevitably loses the habit, the capacity, and eventually the political will to defend itself. Europe's armies shrank. Its stockpiles evaporated. Its defense industries consolidated into slow bureaucratic giants. Its strategic imagination dulled. The EU, meanwhile, found itself carrying not only Europe's security burden, but the costs of global order elsewhere, from the Middle East to East Asia. The war in Ukraine made this imbalance undeniable. While European governments expressed bold rhetoric about defending democracy and resisting Russian aggression, their defense infrastructures faltered, ammunition production lagged behind Ukrainian needs, procurement was fragmented across member states. The EU's promised strategic autonomy remained more slogan than reality. Washington's critique springs from this long-term divergence. The U.S. believes Europe has mistaken moral clarity for strategic readiness. Americans see a continent that speaks of values but relies on American logistics, American intelligence, and American deterrence to uphold those values. For Washington, this is not only unfair, it is strategically dangerous. The U.S. cannot pivot toward the Indo-Pacific, cannot fully manage its rivalry with China, and cannot sustain global commitments if Europe remains a dependent rather than a partner. The deeper source of American frustration, then, is structural and historical. A system built to protect a weak Europe now restrains a wealthy Europe from becoming strong. What Washington resents is not Europe's ideals, but its inertia. The world of 1945 is gone. Yet Europe still behaves like a protected ward of an empire that no longer seeks to be one. Until this contradiction is resolved, America's dissatisfaction will persist and deepen. If one looks only at the numbers, Europe should be a formidable military power. Collectively, the European Union's GDP rivals that of the United States. Many EU states have increased defense spending in response to the Ukraine war. Several have crossed the symbolic threshold of 2% of GDP that NATO has long advocated. Yet when crises emerge, Europe proves startlingly unprepared. This contradiction, high spending, low capability, sits at the center of Washington's critique. The problem is not the quantity of money Europe spends, but the inefficiency with which it is spent. Europe's defense landscape is a patchwork of 27 national militaries, each with its own procurement systems, political constraints, industrial interests, and strategic priorities. Instead of one coherent European defense apparatus, there exists a fragmented mosaic. Tanks, aircraft, artillery systems, and communication platforms are rarely interoperable. Logistics networks remain national rather than continental. Europe pays more for less because it organizes its defense like a collection of small kingdoms rather than a unified geopolitical actor. The consequences of this fragmentation became painfully clear in Ukraine. Europe discovered that despite decades of peace, its ammunition stockpiles were nowhere near sufficient for a modern conflict. Factories that once produced shells at scale had been downsized or shuttered. Air defense systems were in short supply. Long-range strike capabilities were minimal. In practical terms, Europe could not sustain high-intensity warfare without massive U.S. support. This is precisely what frustrates. Europe has the wealth to defend itself, but not the political structures or industrial capacity. American officials see a continent that has invested generously in social welfare, environmental policy, and public services, all admirable goals, while neglecting the foundational infrastructure of security. But they recognize another uncomfortable truth. Europe's political culture is deeply skeptical of military power. After 2 world wars, Europe embraced a model of peace through integration, diplomacy, and law. Military spending in many capitals became not a necessity but an ethical embarrassment. Yet security cannot be outsourced indefinitely. Even when Europe increases spending, the institutional inertia remains overwhelming. Procurement cycles are slow. Major defense projects are mired in bureaucratic rivalries. National armies compete for influence within NATO rather than coordinate effectively. The result is a military apparatus that looks impressive on spreadsheets but falters in practice. From Washington's perspective, Europe must confront a simple reality. Defense spending is not the same as defense capability. Money without integration leads to waste. Strategies without industrial capacity produce slogans, not deterrence. Values without power cannot shape global events. The United States does not demand that Europe militarize itself. Rather, it expects Europe to align its resources with its ambitions. If Europe wishes to be a geopolitical force in the 21st century, it must build not only budgets but institutions. It must transform national militaries into a collective defense identity. Until then, Europe's security model will remain structurally incomplete and America's frustration entirely predictable. Behind Washington's persistent criticism of Europe lies a strategic aspiration that the United States has struggled for decades to articulate clearly. It does not seek a weaker Europe. It seeks a stronger, more self-reliant one. For the U.S., the ideal transatlantic relationship is not defined by dependency but by partnership, not by American protection but by shared responsibility. And yet the structures inherited from the Cold War have made this vision perpetually out of reach. The U.S. wants Europe to evolve into a geopolitical actor capable of securing its own neighborhood, deterring regional threats, and contributing meaningfully to global stability. This desire is not born of altruism. It is rooted in the cold arithmetic of American strategic constraints. The United States now faces its most significant long-term challenge since the mid-20th century, the rise of China. Washington increasingly recognizes that its resources, attention, and military posture must shift toward the Indo-Pacific, but it cannot pivot away from Europe so long as Europe remains strategically dependent. Thus, American criticism of European defense spending is really a plea for transformation. Washington wants Europe to develop capabilities it currently lacks: integrated air defense systems, robust ammunition production, sustainable supply chains, rapid deployment forces, and a coherent command structure. The U.S. expects Europe to move beyond symbolic gestures and invest in industrial-scale readiness. It wants Europe to protect its eastern flank without relying on American logistics and intelligence for every major decision. Crucially, the U.S. wants Europe to overcome its internal divisions. Washington sees the EU's fractured defense landscape as the primary obstacle to European autonomy. 27 national armies, each with different equipment and priorities, cannot function as a unified deterrent. The Americans envision a Europe that standardizes procurement, consolidates production, and harmonizes doctrine, a continent capable of acting collectively rather than as a group of disconnected states. But there is another deeper motive behind Washington's expectations. The U.S. knows that a Europe constantly reliant on American protection cannot shape the world alongside it. A dependent Europe cannot meaningfully contribute to global governance, development, climate solutions, or diplomatic mediation. For the U.S., Europe trapped in dependency becomes not an asset but a burden, unable to shoulder regional crises, unable to project stability, and unable to contribute to the balance of power in a rapidly changing international system. In short, Washington wants a Europe that behaves like its economic size suggests a continent capable of asserting itself strategically, yet American policymakers also understand the paradox. Europe's political identity remains rooted in the belief that peace can be sustained without hard power. Asking Europe to rearm is asking Europe to rethink its self-image, not merely its defense budgets. The U.S. is not demanding obedience. It is demanding alignment between Europe's ambitions and its capabilities. Until that alignment emerges, Washington will continue to criticize, not out of contempt, but out of necessity. For in the eyes of American strategists, the stability of the entire Western alliance depends on a Europe finally prepared to stand on its own legs. Europe stands at a historic inflection point. For decades, the continent has enjoyed prosperity, social stability, and a sense of post-war moral purpose, yet all of it rested quietly on American military guarantees. The U.S. now insists that this arrangement is no longer sustainable, not because Washington seeks to retreat from global responsibilities, but because global realities have fundamentally changed. The question for Europe is stark. Will it confront this new reality or continue to drift under a security order designed for a world that no longer exists? To meet American expectations and, more importantly, to secure its own future, Europe must pursue three transformations simultaneously. First, Europe must integrate its defense capabilities. No amount of increased spending will matter if Europe continues to operate 27 separate procurement systems, incompatible weapons platforms, and fragmented chains of command. A unified European defense industrial base capable of producing ammunition, drones, air defenses, and armored vehicles at scale is essential. Without consolidation, every crisis will reveal the same weaknesses: insufficient stockpiles, slow mobilization, and strategic paralysis. Second, Europe must redefine its political identity around security, not just values. For decades, the EU has been a regulatory superpower, not a military one. Its influence flowed from economic gravity and moral authority. But in a world marked by geopolitical rivalry, these pillars are no longer enough. Europe must accept that power. Military, industrial, and technological is now the currency of international order. If the EU wants to be more than a commentator on global events, it must cultivate a strategic culture built on readiness and deterrence. Third, Europe must develop autonomous deterrent capacity without severing its alliance with the United States. Strategic autonomy does not mean rejection of NATO. It means ensuring that NATO does not require constant American intervention to function. A Europe capable of defending its eastern flank would allow the U.S. to rebalance toward Asia while preserving the Transatlantic alliance. Conversely, a Europe that remains dependent will strain U.S.-EU relations and weaken collective security. Yet the greatest obstacle to this transformation is not financial, it is political. European leaders must build consensus across countries with different histories, threat perceptions, and strategic priorities. Germany's caution, France's ambitions, Eastern Europe's fears, Southern Europe's economic constraints all complicate the path forward. Without political cohesion, the EU will continue to react to crises rather than shape them. Ultimately, Europe must choose between becoming an independent pillar of global stability or remaining a beneficiary of American power. Washington's criticism is a signal, not a reprimand. The world is shifting, and Europe must shift with it. If it fails to adapt, Europe risks becoming strategically irrelevant, wealthy, principled, and powerless in a century defined by hard competition.